Since Katie's readiness to do her work independently was still not evident to anyone, she did her work wherever Jackie happens to be able to do it with her. Movable jobs such as laundry, dusting and tidying were ideal now. Katie's complaints about the need for her to stay near Jackie were less. Jackie was starting to imagine she might be accepting it. Welcome back to the series of me rambling on about a book I love called Building the Bonds of Attachment by Daniel Hughes. I've started with that introductory quote to sort of plot where things are at the moment, really. Which is a slow sense of progress we can feel good about, but certainly not getting carried away with it by any stretch of the imagination. Katie is becoming less resistant to the idea of closeness. Still not open, but less resistant. To stress again, not everything Katie does in a day is chores. They'll be playing with Katie in the garden, chatting to her on the swing, drawing pictures together, all sorts. Some calm, some active, some cooperative, others like Katie playing with Lego while Jackie does some paperwork in the same room. Lots of different types of activities and never one type for too long that Katie starts to struggle. Chores here aren't meant to teach her the value of hard work, as people often say. I find that kind of thing massively overrated personally, but they're good cooperative things Jackie can do with Katie where they both get to feel like they've achieved something at the end, even if it is something small. That's quite nice. Shows her she can do something positive to help her family also. Anyway, things are quietly going quite well. But I talked before about the 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing. This episode we're talking about the Quilt incident, which is quite a touching one, so let's get to it. The Quilt incident itself is quite straightforward. A woman called Judy Morris was stopping by, who's on the school committee and has spent hours making a quilt to be raffled off at the autumn festival. Jackie, who I assume helps with these sort of things, or perhaps because her husband Mark is a teacher, it's not entirely clear, but either way, she has a semi-professional relationship with this Judy Morris, and so Judy was bringing the quilt to Jackie so that Jackie can look after it and display it at various different gatherings in advance of the raffle for people to see it. Drum up hype, I guess, about the quilt. I don't know. So Judy comes up and shows her this elaborate quilt. They talk a bit, but Judy can't stay long, so Jackie very politely walks her to the car before coming back to the house. This elaborate, very impressive looking quilt left neatly on the table. What do you think's happened? When Jackie returned to the living room, she wanted to admire the quilt again. Fear struck her immediately when she saw that it was not on the table. Isn't that where she left it? Of course it was. Katie! She looked over at Katie, who was sorting socks on the living room floor. Katie, where is the quilt? I don't know, Katie replied, her standard response to most questions. As Jackie was about to address Katie again, she saw the quilt on the couch, folded neatly as it had been on the table. Katie must have wanted to look at it. She went and picked it up. Something was wrong. It was wet. Fear returned. She raised it to her face and smelt it. Urine! It was urine. Katie had peed on it. Katie has, of course, peed on things before in this story. She's also pooped on or in stuff a few times, just as she has broken and damaged many, many toys and objects. Bodily fluids are often very good symbolically because it is expelling waste, really, dumping all of your badness onto this outer, perfectly innocent object that has to deal with it instead. It's also quite a tragic symbol for how Katie feels she can't help but ruin everything, and it's a means to get one up on Jackie for once, but I think most crucially a sort of unconscious test. When I really push Jackie's buttons and do something that hurts her, will she give up on me then? Will she finally abandon or shame me and attack me as Sally and Mike used to? If I push her just enough, can I prove she is the same as them after all, and all of this niceness has just been a trick and a fraud, you know? Jackie was in shock. She couldn't move. Tears came to her eyes. She wanted to yell and cry and erase the last 10 minutes of her life. How could she make such a mistake? How could she have left Katie alone with this quilt? What could she say to Judy? What could she do? First, she needed to clean the quilt before the pee really sank in. She knew that Judy had made it for rough wear. She ran to the kitchen sink and soaked it in water. She held it with the water running over the fabric, squeezed it out and then did it again and again. Her own tears mixed with the water running through the quilt. Finally, not knowing what else to do, she laid it out on towels spread on the bed. She would wait to tell Judy until after it had dried and they knew if there was any permanent damage. Whilst I have cut it down there for brevity and to not run into too many copyright issues, I am including a lot more extracts than I normally would do to, I think, try and make it clear how emotionally affected Jackie is by this. Someone on the school committee has spent God knows how many hours making this quilt. It's been trusted to you for a raffle, and that happens almost instantly. But it's also not just that. There have been months of stress with Katie. Jackie has handled everything tremendously, but of course there's been times where she just feels exhausted. But she copes. She handles it until maybe suddenly there's the straw that breaks the camel's back. For Ruth Daly, it was when Katie kicked her son Dustin. For Susan, it was the burger meat incident. Is this it for Jackie? When she finally returned to the living room, Katie looked up at Jackie as if nothing had happened. "Can I have lunch now?" Jackie knelt down in front of Katie. She took her arms in her hands and leaned closer to her. "Katie!" Jackie yelled. "I am very, very angry with you for peeing on that lovely quilt. That was a very mean thing to do to Mrs. Morris. That was not fair to all the kids at your school who will not be able to do some special things if the quilt is ruined. And it was not right to do that to me, since I am responsible for it. Members of this family do not treat other people that way. You are a member of this family. I am angry that you have done this to Mrs. Morris and to our family." At some point, Jackie was always going to lose her temper because she's been living 24/7 with a child that's very good at making people angry. I'm sure 99% of you watching this series have felt all the way through. I could never do what Jackie does. I wouldn't be able to cope without losing it. I felt exactly the same, you know. I've never lost it at all in a session with anyone I've counselled, but I only see the kids for 50 minutes or an hour a week. If I had to see them all the time, I would probably lose it. Or at least that's what I imagine and fear, I guess. And so with Jackie, she does lose it here. To be fair, she's very eloquent in losing her temper. It could have been a lot worse than this. She doesn't say it is mean herself, just that what she did was mean. Her behaviour was mean. And she also reaffirms this idea that Katie is a member of the family. Her doing this doesn't mean she's rejected and abandoned. She's still a member of the family. But she did lose her temper, and Katie's expression in response is quite meaningful. Jackie saw her usual guarded, resentful look she often had when being confronted with her behaviours, but she also saw another look. Katie seemed to be both somewhat afraid of Jackie's anger and also pleased that Jackie was mad at her. Katie got Jackie mad. She was in control, and Jackie was finally telling Katie that she was a bad girl. This is where knowledge, I think, is really important, and why I wish so much more education was done for teachers and parents alike. Telling someone just how hurt and upset and angry you are with what they've done, and them looking delighted about it, that just twists the knife another level, doesn't it? Not only are you hurt by what they've done, but now they're pleased that you're so hurt. They enjoy it. You'd really want to lose your temper then. But as I say, this is where education can matter, because that's not really what the look is. It's not a personal thing there. As I've said, it's more to do with Katie re-establishing what she's used to than it is a personal attack against Jackie as a person. And it's, I think, with that awareness and understanding that you need that for Jackie to do what she does next. Jackie kept staring into Katie's eyes. She took a deep breath. This would be hard for Jackie, but she had to continue talking. "Katie, I love you, sweetie. I love you a lot, and it's very important I continue teaching you how important it is not to do things like this to people. I know that it's hard for you to learn, but since I love you, I'm going to keep trying until you get it." Jackie reached over and gave her a hug. Tears came. She pulled back, staring into Katie's startled eyes. Katie was bewildered. She could not begin to understand or express the effect that now enveloped her. Jackie was crying just like all her other foster mothers had done, but this felt different, and she did not know why. Katie sensed that she was not in control, and she was frightened. Jackie gave her one last hug, then got up and went into the kitchen. An incredible moment, incredible control over her emotions. And when I talk about the need to understand and the awareness of what's really going on with Katie to be able to do this, that makes it sound just like what she's doing is this technique, this I've got to hold back how I feel and instead respond in this clear kind of technique way. And there is some truth to that, but she's also responding with her genuine feelings at the same time. You know, it's not a lie that she loves Katie. It's none of this she's saying is at all wrong or forced. Deep down, it's exactly what she means, and part of the reason she is so stressed and in that moment feels so angry and perhaps like shaming Katie the way she expects is because she loves her so much, and she's poured so much devotion and care into Katie that it's so frustrating to see things like this happen. So I don't want to give the impression how she's responding there is entirely inauthentic. It's not. It's a kind of deeper authenticity, I think, beyond just your surface level anger, to dig deeper into the feelings behind that and be able to express them instead. It's a very difficult thing to do nonetheless, to be clear on what you're expressing and not just react senselessly, I guess. It's a moment that's followed later by a conversation between Jackie and her husband Mark in his book, who doesn't get mentioned enough, I don't think, but he is crucial in the story, and I think we get a nice moment later in another chapter where we really see that. But he goes to work, so he doesn't see Katie as much, but he is very supportive. I don't think any foster parent could do this alone with someone like Katie. She needs both him and Alison supporting her. Mark was strong for Jackie when she needed him to be. He was also able to recognise that Jackie was strong for him when he needed her to be. They talk, mostly Mark listens and is very supportive. He reassures Jackie that she did about as well as anyone could do, which is entirely true. Jackie says how telling Katie she loved her in that moment was the hardest thing she had ever done, and whilst it's a true fact that she does love her, I also 100% believe that. Crucially though, Mark also asks if there's anything more he can be doing to help, and they agree upon certain times where Mark will take charge so that Jackie can go out and get a break to see a friend or something. Which is entirely understandable. You know, it is important Jackie is the person who Katie gets close to and spends all this close time with, but at the same time, of course she needs a break. There's nothing wrong with that. It's so hard sometimes, giving, when it really does not feel like it matters. My mind goes into, why bother? She doesn't care, why should I? You know who the perfect person to talk to in this situation is? It's Alison. This is where the chapter gets incredibly touching. So as usual, Jackie gets time to speak to Alison alone before Katie comes in. Jackie needs that time right now, and Alison tells her Katie doesn't need a saint or a robot. She needs a mum who loves her, who sweats for her, who cries for her, and at times who gets angry with her. She doesn't need you to be perfect, Jackie. She simply needs you to remain committed to her. When Katie comes in, the session starts as ever with a lot of fun and joking regardless of Katie's behaviour. It's only much later the quilt gets brought up, and I think we're not really going to talk about the rest of this chapter. I don't think I'll need to. Instead, I think it's just more important to try and convey the emotion properly in a story here. I'll try as best I can with my not the most expressive voice. But when the right moment comes, Alison says, "Oh, Katie, your mum mentioned you peeing on the quilt. I was a little mixed up. What made you decide to do that?" "Don't talk about it." "But sweetie, it's something we need to talk about because I know that you and your mum have had a lot of feelings about this week, and it makes it important to both of you." "It's not important to me," Katie declared. "I know it's hard for you to talk about. No problem. I can help." "I don't want your help." "I know you don't. I know you don't. You might want to say, 'Leave me alone, Alison.'" Alison then leaned closer. "I know that taking our help is hard for you, sweetie. So hard." "Shut up, shut up, shut up! You want me to shut up. You want me to stop talking about how mad you are and at your mum, Jackie." Alison paused for a moment. "But I need to talk a little more because I know you're probably also feeling sad and scared about what happened and that you don't like yourself very much." "I do like myself." "You do like yourself, yes. And I'm also thinking that when you peed on the quilt, after that, it was hard to like yourself right then," Alison said with empathy. "I do like myself!" Katie now had tears running down her cheeks. Katie was barely moving. She was not looking at Allison. She was lost somewhere in the despair of her past. Allison leaned forwards and whispered into Katie's ear. I wish you did, sweetie. I want to help you really like yourself. Katie climbed up onto Jackie's lap and began to shake as tears continued to flow down her cheeks. Jackie hugged her tighter, and Katie squeezed her in return. Jackie began to rock slowly. Allison sat motionless, watching Katie and Jackie, not wanting to disturb the mood. They had never seen Katie cry before this moment. Jackie now knew that what had happened around the Quilt incident was important to Katie after all. Her empathy for Katie became strong again. Katie, 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 Jackie said quietly as she rocked her slowly in her arms. Allison waited a few minutes, until after Katie had stopped crying. Allison then asked her to look at Jackie's face. Katie noticed that Jackie had been crying too. She stared a moment. Allison then said, Katie, my guess is you'd like to say to your mum, I'm sorry for peeing on the quilt. Immediately, Katie said to Jackie, Mum, I'm sorry for peeing on the quilt. She began crying again, and Jackie embraced her again. I'm glad that you're sorry, Katie. I forgive you. I'm glad for you. I'm glad for us now. Our hearts are together. It's so moving. Katie possibly has not cried at all since she was a baby, and then we get this. It's so moving, and though I've edited the extract down quite a lot there, I hope it still conveys the emotion. Following this, they have downtime for the rest of the session, a moment of silence to enjoy the embrace. Then Jackie gets a tissue to dab Katie's eyes. Allison points out that she needs a tissue too, and they have a good moment of humour trying to figure out who has the stickiest tears. This downtime after the very emotional moment is important to kind of pull things back, give the experience a bit of closure, and not leave Katie feeling too exposed or embarrassed about it. You know, thank God this didn't happen right at the end of the session, because then it's always very difficult to give the downtime that's often needed. And in that sense, Allison no doubt had the foresight to bring this up in the conversation, probably about midpoint into the session, so that there is still a lot of time to have that downtime after. We're not going to discuss the rest of the chapter here, because there is more. It's interesting to read in the book, but I also think it kind of covers ground I discussed last time. Which is basically that in a drive back from the session, there's a little argument that comes out of what Katie wants for dinner, all of it then leading to her angrily declaring, I'm glad that I peed on the quilt. And later, you're not my mum, I hate you. Because remember what I said about 1 step forwards, 1 step back, or 2 steps, or whatever it was? Katie reasserting and resisting this new way of thinking and feeling. That often happens, but it doesn't mean what happened in the session wasn't true. All of that still counts and was still progress, even if it leaves Katie feeling a bit exposed and unsure and confused by this new progress and feeling, so she has to sort of try and re-establish the previous stuff. That doesn't cancel any of it out, and you got to kind of be aware of that. I quite like the way Daniel Hughes describes it as well. Katie was frightened. She'd revealed a lot in therapy, to Jackie and to herself. She was now trying to minimise or deny her earlier expressions. Let's have a quick think about the big exchange in Allison's sessions before we end. I'll give you like 4 or 5 points I think about it. 1, she's been having over 3 months of sessions by this point, and Katie is used to Allison talking about some of Katie's bad behaviour. Like they had that playful discussion about her spilling milk and things. There have been several examples of that, so this exchange is not out of nowhere. 2, we've seen moments before this in the book. If I reference them in the videos, I can't remember, but there have been moments where Katie has shown sadness. Not much, definitely not cried, but hints of possible sadness somewhere rather than just a reaction of anger to everything. And I think that partly gives Allison an indication for how far she can go with this. You know, she knows Katie is moving along this line of feeling the emotion. At 3, Jackie is sitting there next to Katie. Jackie is the person, if anyone, that Katie has some form of bond with. She's a person Katie could turn to when she cried, who would comfort her. If there wasn't that comfort available, if it was just Allison sitting opposite and Katie had cried on her own, that wouldn't have been great for her specifically. Although I doubt she would have been able to cry without Jackie present. The power of this moment isn't just that she cries, it's that when she cries, she can be given comfort and she can experience that comfort. For the intention here from Alison would not have been, let's see if I can make Katie cry now. That would have been a very strange motivation for any counsellor. The intention is more to resolve the whole conflict around the Quilt incident, not leave it as this unaddressed issue hanging in the air between Jackie and Katie, but to help Katie move beyond the shame and, if possible, help Katie apologise for it. Not to teach her good behaviour, and it's good to apologise, but to give her a chance for Katie to feel forgiven inside. Being able to apologise for things can be very, very hard, but we feel relieved afterwards. A weight gets lifted and the barrier is removed. And not just for Katie either, but for Jackie as well, who's felt some degree of anger and resentment and probably a level of emotional distance between the two of them following the Quilt incident. So for Katie to apologise and to mean it, and for this experience to happen, helps reunite the both of them together. I'm going to end this one here though. It's a very moving, great moment in the story. However, it is not enough. I sort of touched on this in my final Good Will Hunting video. One experience of being able to cry and receiving comfort is not enough. And this is a session directly followed by Katie trying to reassert the opposite. A lot more positive experiences will be needed to effect real change, but this is an important start. I love this chapter because it's the first time Katie cries, but there is most definitely more to follow. I look forward to more touching moments. As always, like the video if you liked it, share your thoughts, subscribe, buy the book, support me on Patreon if you want to help keep the channel going, maybe check out my Instagram, but whatever, just hopefully see you next time.
And as ever, a special thank you goes to Janice McMahon, Luke Hoare, CrzychuKB, Michael Gallagher, InSquares, Dustin Paulson, Brian Herring, Samara Salsi, Sharikov2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.